Życzymy Państwu przyjemnej podróży.
Teraz chyba mikrofon działa, prawda?
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Andrzej Kompa and our guest today is Thierry Wolton.
Najpierw 3 minuty, obiecałem, że tylko tyle przedstawienia naszego dzisiejszego gościa. Jest to pisarz, w pewnym sensie także historyk z wykształcenia dziennikarz, zaczynał liberacją w Radio France Internationale, ale od wielu już dekad pisze książki, których napisał kilkadziesiąt i które zostały przetłumaczone na więcej niż 10 języków, dotyczące historii komunizmu, krajów komunistycznych, stosunków politycznych w Europie. My dzisiaj się spotykamy wokół dwóch, trzech wydanych polskich tłumaczeń książki, którą Thierry
talking about the Polish translation of the books that he wrote between 2012 and 2017.
Polski tytuł Historia komunizmu na świecie. Jeszcze czekamy w Polsce na trzeci tom, Le Complice,
and we are still waiting for the third volume,
pierwszy Kaci.
The Accomplices. It will be published next year.
To trudne pisać o systemie,
the first volume,
tak żeby na
The
każdej stronie było widać człowieka.
And it's so hard to write the system and make sure that on every page you see actual human beings, both the victims and the executioners.
Poszerzeniem wielu książek
So this is basically a summing up, but also a broader description of what was described in previous books.
Pierwszy tom jest bardziej tomem
And our guest did a great job. The first volume describes how communism was created, about the Bolshevik Revolution of Lenin, Stalin, how it spreads across the world, and then up until the 1980s. And in the second volume, the focus is on the victims, but also it focuses on those who are in power, about the different ways of acting, different weird ways of acting of those in power.
Bardzo wielu ważnych książek.
And our guest today has written a lot of important books. They've been published since the 1970s. To Live in the West, KGB in France,
Wielka rekrutacja, o książki poświęconej w znacznej części temu, jak w elitach państw zachodnich, zwłaszcza Francji, odbywała się infiltracja i kontakt z komunistycznymi służbami.
Especially in France, how they were infiltrated and how they were contacted by the communist secret service. He wrote about secret relations between the countries.
Psychoanaliza Francji.
Then a short psychoanalysis of France. And then the most recent books written after the world history of communism.
Stalin i Hitler,
the left negationism and other books.
W tym roku, w 2024,
the most recent one from 2024,
powrót czasów barbarzyńskich,
the return of barbaric times, and in relation to the current Russian invasion in Ukraine. So it's a great honor to have you here with us.
Bez pytań, Thierry Wolton do Państwa przemówi.
In the beginning, there will be an opening statement without any questions.
Ça marche. Bonjour à tous, merci d'être là. Je voudrais d'abord dire que je suis très content
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am extremely happy that I can be here in Poland and talk about a topic which I'm very familiar with.
Dont certains ne connaissent pas cette époque, puisque vous n'étiez pas nés pour certains d'entre vous.
I started my research on communism in Poland.
Il n'y avait pas encore Solidarność. Et moi, j'étais jeune journaliste, j'avais 24
It was in the beginning of the 1970s, before the Solidarity movement. I was 24 or 25 years old. I was a journalist, a reporter.
Vous voyez l'ouvrier modèle, le communiste modèle, et vous ne voyez pas les gens. Donc moi, ce qui m'intéressait, c'est de fréquenter
So I
les gens.
visited Poland back then.
Voir un peu
Everyone imagines how communism looks like, but I was interested in the personal dimension. You already had some workers' movement, you had strikes, for example, in the Ursus manufacturing plant. Maybe some of you remember that. So for me, such reports were very important. I had a chance to meet with physical workers, but also with intellectualists who supported them. That often happened in the communist times. The authorities were trying to divide the society. One of the intellectuals, Adam Michnik, just had a lecture here. We are still friends. We've been friends since those times. I visited many communist countries, but these people showed me all the various aspects of communism and its ideas, and thanks to them I understood communism. So it was thanks to my visit in Poland, because that was the beginning, that shaped me and my professional life. That's how I wrote this book, the 3 volumes of A World History of Communism. I believe we would need several additional volumes to make sure we provide a comprehensive description. But the story is still ongoing. Communism has not ended. China is a big communist state. I hope I'll have a chance to talk about that today.
À notre encontre, c'est-à-dire contre nous.
So it's a country that behaves like a classical communist state. It acts against its people.
Je voudrais, dans ce bref liminaire, je vais essayer de me limiter parce que je suis excessivement bavard.
So their policy certainly deserves a commentary from us. Of course, we have a limited time, so I'll try to be brief.
Qui sont assez vivaces dans les esprits.
So I'd like to focus on 3 myths of communism which are very present in human minds. History unfortunately knows about them, and I'd like to share my view on such myths. For me, this is a very personal book.
Parce que c'est quand même ma vision des choses.
It's not history in general, but it is the history. It's my own subjective, personal history. I do not believe in objective history. Everyone has their own, and they defend their own point of view. So, first of all, facts are important. You cannot falsify them, you cannot hide them.
Donc il faut respecter à la fois
and chronology is also very important. So you have to respect the facts and the chronology.
Absolue, chacun est libre d'avoir ses interprétations. Quelqu'un d'autre pourrait faire un livre, une histoire mondiale du communisme.
So I followed these rules. Everyone can provide their own interpretation. Someone else could write a history that would be a glorification of communism. Whereas I am accusing communism, I have a negative view of it, and I am glad that that's my message.
En tant que mythe, etc. Donc je vais vous parler de 3 mythes rapidement. Le premier mythe, c'est la révolution communiste.
Debunk, dispel everything related to communism and all that surrounded it. The first myth is the communist revolution. That actually never happened. You had 26 communist countries, but in none of them was there a revolution when the people would take over the power by overthrowing the previous government. There was a Bolshevik revolution in October of 1917. 1917, then there was a certain attack on several buildings.
Donc dans un pays excessivement fragilisé, avec un tsar qui était déjà parti.
Let's remember that it was during the First World War, so you had an interim government, so it was also a coup d'etat against of the Bolsheviks. And that happened in February of 1918. So maybe it was the war that brought about communism. That's what happened in Poland, because Poland became a country subjected to communism because of the war.
Des Occidentaux qui n'ont pas vraiment lutté contre cette occupation.
And it happened also with the help of Western countries who did not help Poland. Sometimes you have civil wars. That's what happened in China. So let's say at the end of the 1940s, in China, on the one hand you had communism, and on the other hand nationalism.
Fomenté en partie par l'occupation japonaise. Donc nous sommes aussi dans un cadre
There was a civil war. And it was also caused by the occupation of Japan. So you had communists fighting with nationalists, but it was all related to the fact that they were jointly fighting against the Japanese. Also, let's not forget colonialism. So we have Indochina, so Vietnam and Cambodia. There was just one country where it happened in a different way, and that was Cuba.
Des professionnels de la révolution et qui profitent
so in Cuba, you can say you had professional revolutionists, and they benefited from the circumstances that were there, a certain mood, atmosphere.
Vous savez, Cuba était avant Castro, c'était un bordel et un casino.
So there was a mafia, there was infiltration, and they benefited from that. Before Castro's rule, there was a big mess, actually, and we can say that the mess remained there, all the chaos, but maybe it had a different structure.
Et éventuellement, il n'y a pas de contact entre les
Tourists still were able to enjoy themselves in Cuba, but there was still a lot of chaos.
Soyons clairs.
So Cuba is an exemption, and it's not that the people gained the power. You had some fighters, it was 5,000-6,000 of them, so the dictator ran away. So we could also say it was a kind of coup d'etat.
Dans le cadre justement des guerres coloniales. Donc, le but de la révolution qu'on nous présente, vous savez, la prise du palais d'hiver, etc., les films qui ont eu après la lutte 17,
so what we are told about the Winter Palace, the insurgency on the Winter Palace, these are myths which are not true.
Je vais essayer d'être assez rapide. C'est un modèle
But what's interesting here and what we must understand
Karl Marx pensait que l'exploitation des ouvriers allait conduire à la révolution parce que exploités, ils briseraient leur chaîne et ils prendraient le pouvoir. Ça n'a pas marché comme ça, puisqu'à partir de la fin du XIXe siècle, les syndicats apparaissent d'abord, ils défendent les ouvriers, et puis les ouvriers, au lieu de faire la révolution, ils pensent plutôt à gagner un peu plus.
Then you had unions to defend the workers, the aim was to increase their salaries.
D'avoir des avantages pour les travailleurs.
So the working class was trying to improve their economic situation.
Lénine qui était, alors, si on fait une hiérarchie, je fais une petite parenthèse, j'aime beaucoup les parenthèses, excusez-moi, j'espère que vous me suivrez, en général je reviens sur mes pieds, je vous rassure.
I'm sorry about the side notes.
Et sans doute si on fait un classement des dictateurs, appelons-les comme ça, communistes, je mettrais Lénine en premier, parce que c'est lui qui a tout inventé. Tout ce qui a suivi après a été prévu par Lénine, pas forcément prévu dans le détail, j'entends bien, mais il a été mis en place par Lénine. Staline, Mao, etc. Le deuxième,
it was introduced by him. Then Stalin, Mao, that was just a consequence of Lenin's ideas.
C'est Mao, parce que Mao c'est le pire de tous. Le Mao,
and the next stage is Stalin and Mao.
Vous me direz, ils étaient plus nombreux, donc c'est normal qu'il y en ait eu plus. Mais surtout parce qu'il était assez.
And we can discuss which one of them was the worst, depending on the number of
alors que Staline, aussi bizarre que ça puisse paraître, était quelqu'un d'assez franc, dans le sens où quand il voulait
may sound strange,
il le disait.
but if Stalin wanted to eliminate someone, he would just say so.
En 1942, le ministre de la Défense, alors que il y a la guerre évidemment de Moscou,
so
et lui dit,
1942,
on t'a pas encore fusillé, toi?
There's a war
ça, c'est le
going
genre
on.
d'humour de Staline, on l'apprécie.
And Stalin is asking someone, oh, you have not been killed
Il y avait quelque
yet.
chose d'assez franc. Bon, donc je reviens à Lénine.
So that's how Stalin acted. He was quite honest in what he
C'est
did.
que Lénine a donc
But
tout
let's
prévu,
go
et
back
Lénine,
to
étant
Lenin.
désespéré de la situation de la classe ouvrière,
Lenin
a dit on va
planned
pas attendre que la
everything.
classe ouvrière se
He
révolte,
foresaw
on va créer
everything. He said that we cannot
parti
wait
révolutionnaire
for
professionnel
the working
qui va prendre le
class
pouvoir et qui, au nom du prolétariat,
rise
va imposer la dictature du prolétariat.
oppose
C'est
those in
exactement ce
power.
qui s'est fait passer dans tous les pays communistes
That
qui
at
sont
some point we'll have
communistes.
the dictatorship
Mais comme vous
of
le
the
savez, le prolétariat n'a jamais
proletariat,
exercé le pouvoir,
and
parce
that
que c'est toujours
was
le parti
supposed to
au nom du
happen in
prolétariat
all communist
qui a exercé le
countries.
pouvoir. D'ailleurs, on disait déjà à l'époque, déjà dès 1918, c'est-à-dire un an après la prise du pouvoir, on parlait le peuple russe et
So
les ouvriers en
since
particulier
1918,
ne parlaient pas de
so 1
dictature
year
du prolétariat,
after
ils parlaient de
the
dictature
revolution,
sur le prolétariat.
they
Donc c'est ce
actually
modèle
wouldn't
léniniste,
talk
si je puis
about
dire, qui a toujours servi. Donc
the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship over the proletariat.
est une mauvaise image.
That's all Lenin's doing.
Est une
So
fausse image plutôt.
actually,
C'est un mensonge.
the Bolshevik Revolution has
référence à la Révolution française.
bad
etc.
associations.
Deuxième mythe,
Some
la paix.
try to
Vous
compare
savez
it
que
with
le
the
camp
French
socialiste
Revolution.
s'est longtemps prévalu d'être le camp de la paix. C'est quand même assez drôle quand on voit
And now
ce
the
qui s'est
second
passé
myth. So,
et
talking
l'usage
about
des armes qui ont
peace,
été faites
some
à
say
l'extérieur,
they are
si je puis
for
dire, et vous en avez
peace.
été victime évidemment, vous-même, en Pologne ici même, mais je ne parle pas forcément de la paix extérieure, je parle de la paix intérieure.
This was
Je parle de la
also
dictature du prolétariat, de la
used in
dictature sur le
Poland. I'm
prolétariat,
talking
dictature
about
sur le
domestic
La
peace.
particularité du communisme par rapport à tous les autres pouvoirs qui ont existé
So you
jusqu'à
have a
maintenant,
dictatorship that was
y
trying
compris les
to
dictatures
control the people.
c'est qu'ils ont mené une guerre civile permanente
All
contre leur
dictatorships are using certain
permanente.
instruments,
C'est-à-dire qu'elle
also
n'a
fascist
jamais
dictatorships,
Alors
but they
pourquoi
are all acting
C'est ça qui est
against their
intéressant. En
own
vérité,
people.
c'est le modèle
And
marxiste
why is
qui a
it
été
happening?
appliqué. Marxiste-léniniste.
Because actually
puisque
it's a
Lénine
Marxist
a mis ça à
model
sa
that's
sauce,
being
mais quand même
used.
à l'origine, il y a la théorie marxiste. Qu'est-ce que dit la théorie marxiste?
Lenin
La théorie marxiste dit que
reached
pour
to the
avancer dans
sources,
l'histoire,
but
il faut
actually the
la lutte
Marxist
des classes et
ideology
non,
is behind
voilà ce
all
que
of
dit
that.
exactement Marx dans le manifeste du Parti
What did
communiste.
Marx say
La
in
lutte des
the
classes est le moteur
Communist
de l'histoire.
Manifesto?
Je le répète, la lutte
That
des
the
classes est
fight
le moteur de
between
l'histoire.
classes is
Ça
the
veut dire que si
driving
vous voulez
force
avancer dans l'histoire,
behind history.
vous êtes obligé de faire de la lutte des classes. Or,
So
dans la
if you
théorie
want to
marxiste,
have
avancer dans
progress in
l'histoire, ça veut dire
history, then you
après
have to
après le
rely on
capitalisme, instaurer le
the
socialisme,
fight
qui
between
lui-même va
different
amener
classes.
au communisme. C'est ça,
So
avancer
after
dans l'histoire,
capitalism, you
dans la
will
théorie
have socialism, and
marxiste-léniniste.
that will lead to
Donc, si vous
communism,
voulez aller
and
sur
that
le
will
chemin
be
du
the
socialisme
progress
et
of
après
history
préparer le
according
communisme,
to
vous
the
devez faire de la lutte
Marxist
des
and
classes.
Leninist
C'est le moteur de
ideology.
l'histoire,
So
c'est
if
votre
we
carburant,
want to
c'est votre
follow
essence.
this path leading to
Eh bien,
communism,
voilà.
we have
Qu'est-ce que ça a
to
donné? Ça a donné à peu
have
près 100 millions de morts.
war
Sur le dos,
between
pays
different
confondu.
classes.
Hein, c'est quand même pas mal. Nul
And what
régime
was the
au monde
consequence?
n'a fait
About
autant de morts.
100 million victims.
Nulle situation
No other
historique n'en fait
regime
autant de morts.
anywhere
On peut
else
éventuellement parler de
caused so many
dizaines de
victims.
millions de morts en ce qui concerne l'esclavage, puisque l'esclavage a duré 2 siècles, 3 siècles. Le
We
communisme
could
a
say
duré
there
70
are
ans.
tens of
C'est la même
millions
chose.
in slavery,
Donc,
but that
en termes de
lasted for
rapidité
2-3
et
centuries, whereas
d'efficacité, on
communism
n'a pas fait mieux, si je
lasted
puis dire. Les hommes n'ont pas fait mieux
just for
en
a
ce qui
couple
concerne
of decades.
ce
So
problème.
no
Donc,
one
cette
has
lutte des
come up
classes, elle a
with
été utilisée- elle a été utilisée
a better
par tous les
mechanism
pays
if you want
communistes, sans aucune
to
exception.
achieve
Alors,
the
un jour, c'est
highest
les
number
paysans,
of
une fois, c'est les
victims.
intellectuels,
And that
les
was the
religieux,
case in all
les
the
bourgeois,
communist states.
les membres du parti aussi qui n'ont pas échappé au couperet pour certains d'entre eux. Bref, ce monde de paix
People
est
from
un monde de
different
guerre en
classes would
vérité,
become
non seulement de
victims
guerre à
of
l'extérieur,
this system.
mais de guerre civile à l'intérieur. Et
So
les gens
the
qui ont vécu,
alleged
je
peace
pense
that
pas
is
que dans
supposed
cette
to
salle, il y a des
appear
gens qui ont
actually
vécu
is
le
a
communisme à
war,
l'époque,
is a world of war.
avant
Maybe some of you
90,
remember
peut-être certains d'entre
the
vous, mais
communist
il y avait
rule.
effectivement une
So
volonté
it was
de
before
lutter
the transformation.
contre l'ennemi, et évidemment contre le bien occidental, contre l'ennemi capitaliste.
So maybe you remember that
voulait notre peau.
they wanted you to fight with the enemy, with the capitalist who is a threat to us, so we have to remain vigilant, and that's why you had political police.
Le troisième mythe,
And that's the
alors c'est
other
celui
myth.
qui revient régulièrement, c'est l'égalité.
And the third myth that keeps on reoccurring is the equality myth. Communists are all about equality. That was the repeated motto that, contrary to the capitalists who are exploiting the workers and where you have different classes, in communism you are supposed to have equality, but that is false, absolutely false. No system had more inequality than the communist system. First of all, the nomenclature. So members of the Communist Party had their own stores, they had their own health facilities, they lived on a completely different level. And the highest representatives of the political party had an even better life, like members of the KGB, the secret police, and also just regular officials in various places in those countries under communism. So you could see this is a visible side, something that we know about it, of this lack of equality.
Inequality between those who hold power and those who are subject to them. The other inequality that is even worse is what I am saying about it, power and subordinates. The authorities could decide about the life and death of regular citizens. There is nothing more precious than life, I hope you would agree. Life is priceless for us. So the authority that has the power to, that in the name of class fight could deprive people of their lives is something I believe puts the communist system as the most unequal system. So there is no peace, there is no equality. Let me hand over to our moderator. I hope I didn't take too much of his time.
Mamy naprawdę dużo czasu. Proszę Państwa, tym niemniej nasz panel jest godzinny, więc to nie będą jakieś rozbudowane erudycyjne pytania, których można by wokół 3500 stron tej książki zadać. Postaram się zadać pytania proste i relevantne dla sytuacji teraz w 2024.
My first one is, as the argument keeps reappearing, communism was not that bad. The performance was awful. That argument is frequently presented by Artlev. What are your most favorite counter-arguments to this thesis?
Alors, c'est assez simple d'y répondre, parce que s'il y avait eu un seul pays communiste, on pourrait éventuellement...
There is a simple answer to that. If there was one communist country, you could doubt it. You could take some analysis of different conditions, but there used to be 26 communist countries throughout the world, and all of them had the same effect, with no exception. Russia, Cambodia, China. We know that the Pol Pot regime terminated 1/3 of the population in 3 years' time. So the argument that says the theory is good, but the practice was wrong, doesn't make sense. It's not consistent, in my opinion. There was only one single form of evidence, but there were 26 cases. I believe there are still people who believe in communism. That's a major problem, but I understand that possibly you can appreciate the Marxist theory, which has some interesting elements in it, not just regarding the fight of clash of classes, but other historic theories. I have this Marxist theory in, I know it very well. I lived through March 1968 in Paris. I read lots of books by Marx, by Lenin. I understand all the terms from those books. I don't know, when I was a teenager at that time, I probably wasn't able to understand it. But later on, Marxism and Leninism, all is negative. I don't know what you could spare out of it. Why? Using Marxism in a situation, as I said before, I never speak of Marxism as such. I speak of Marxism-Leninism. That is communism. You mustn't separate these two aspects. I told you before, Lenin did for communism, and that was inevitable. That's the theory. Lenin hurt communism most. It all came from him, and his successors followed his theory.
Chciałbym wyprowadzić dwa następne pytania. Pierwsze jest takie.
Then the question. In Europe, we have different shades of attitude to communism, especially in 1945. The countries that experienced right-wing dictatorships, Spain, Portugal, Greece, the students and opposition movement, and the discussion taken over by the mainstream, the tolerance for communism and taking over socialist and communist arguments was more frequent. Starting from the Salazar's country collapsed in Portugal, there were two parties. One was right-wing, the other one was left-wing. One was named Social Democrat, the other was Socialist. The countries in the former Soviet bloc were allergic to communism. For people who were unaware of history, was a word of disgust.
Francja to jeszcze inny przypadek.
Is another story.
Jak w ciągu ostatnich, powiedzmy, 3, 4, 5 dekad ten podział rozumienia komunizmu i stosunku społecznego do komunizmu zmienia się w Europie.
Social attitudes to communism has been changing in Europe. Apart from the fact it determined the elections in Europe after 1945, what's happening to this division now? Does it matter?
Non, heureusement, les choses évoluent. Bon, il faut quand même se remettre dans le contexte de l'époque, si je puis dire.
Things do change, but you need to place them in the context of the time.
On joue un très grand rôle dans cette affaire-là. Je prends des intellectuels occidentaux, ceux qui,
the intellectuals who played a remarkable role in. I'm speaking about free intellectuals, not from communist countries, but those who could actually freely assess what was happening behind the Iron Curtain that was not happening in France, because, as you know, French intellectuals were pretty guilty of crimes against humanity. So the attractiveness for intellectuals, where did it come from? I'm back to Lenin. They were fascinated by Lenin because deep in the communist, in the heart of the communist system formed by Lenin, he gave them a historic role. During for 10 years, where he was writing that the only method is to run a revolution is not hoping for the workers, but to build revolutionists who would speak for the working class. So he assigned this role to intellectuals. He believed that the lower classes could not voice their opinion, and the heart of the system was filled by intellectuals who had a great role to play, that glorified them. So that was of greatest damage. And intellectuals who in communist countries, they were in a position where the first to be eliminated is a fact. Quite often.
des vers absolument terribles sur
contribution of some intellectuals who wrote awful texts, especially in the 1930s. They highlighted the need to eliminate the enemy. Let's think for 30 seconds. Said Palia, who was a French author and who was very close to the Nazi, who glorified Nazism, but less he praised Nazis than Aragon praised communism. But we can see that Aragon never went to hell. Is still being taught at schools. It's one of the greatest French writers. So, as you can see, these are the situation here.
Il y en avait beaucoup qui avaient quitté le bateau avant, quand même. Je pense à un intellectuel français que j'aime beaucoup personnellement, qui est toujours vivant, qui s'appelle Guillaume Morin, qui a été exclu du parti, qui a écrit un livre formidable.
There is one of those who was excluded from the party.
Dans le sens où il est exclu du parti parce que
I can't remember the title of the book he wrote, but it was an excellent book where he was from a position, he wrote why he couldn't be with the Communist Party any longer, and in one moment he wrote how he felt about all that.
Il assiste à son procès, il est là. Il sort de là, plus personne ne lui dit un mot, plus personne ne lui parle. Il sort tout seul et il pleure comme un petit enfant.
At the trial, nobody spoke to him. He cried like a child.
Il met 3-4 jours
But I have no reason to cry.
Parce que le parti l'a exclu, sa famille, ses amis, tout ça. Donc,
get a grip, but he felt abandoned by the party to which he devoted his heart. That's the French case, but we have got excellent examples from America, especially that Americans never actually understood communism, while French, considering the French Revolution and the revolutionary spirit, could understand it better. That never happened in America.
Du communisme, il a quand même beaucoup disparu et évidemment la chute de 1991 a considérablement clarifié la situation.
How communism was doing on, well, the fall of communism changed the situation in Europe. Certainly we will still have Marxists, Leninists,
espère encore, je connais je pense à un Français encore une fois, excusez-moi de
still hope.
Je pense qu'il mérite pas d'être connu.
I also think about some French, sorry for referring to French, but that's something I know best. Benu, who is a great philosopher, who was a professor, a Marxist, and believed that cultural revolution in China that killed many millions of people was something good. So there are different human types. And I'm not joking that we cannot place them in formaldehyde. There are different types. We need to agree that people think differently. When we speak about dictatorships, we have mentioned before, if we speak of right-wing dictatorships, it's natural that people would turn to the left. And when we speak about Marxism and Leninism, I believe that in Portugal or Spain or Greece, that is the countries that experience fascism, they will always perceive Marxism and Leninism differently than the French do or other nations. Yet I'm pretty calm about intellectuals and communism. Let's see how the things go on. But now, I believe we need to face it, but it's not a major problem.
Je fais une petite parenthèse, excusez-moi. J'ai le plaisir de
I need to add one more thing. I'm very happy that Adam Michnik is here with us.
Comme je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure en introduction,
because as I said before,
parce que je l'aurais peut-être pas dit.
Well, you weren't here with us.
Dans sa jeunesse aussi, dans notre
jeunesse. When I was young, I knew Adam Michnik.
Content de pouvoir le redire devant lui.
I'm so happy that I now can be here. I remember the conversations we held with Jacek Michnik, Adam Michnik, Jacek Kuroń. They made me what I am today. So I'm happy I can say it again in the presence of Adam Michnik.
To swoją drogą zupełnie unikatowy wgląd
That's a
w
pretty
życie dysydentów,
unique
wtedy, kiedy byli
insight
dysydentami.
into the life of dissidents
Wiem też, że
when they
spotykał się
were
również
dissidents. I know
Wacławem
at that
Hawlem,
time you met
Sacharowem,
Václav Havel, Andrzej Sakharov, so the perspective regarded different Soviet bloc countries. Well, one more thing from the original question.
naszej części Europy, w tym co
In our part of Europe,
morzem, Trójmorzem,
so something they name Marium, or what people say is former communist bloc, something that is being wiped up by those who would like to eradicate all the left-wing
jednym z głównych wrogów komunistów byli
one
przecież
of
socjaliści,
the
socjaldemokraci.
communist major enemies were socialists and social democrats, as long as we had the bipolar system, where somebody was considered by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as the bourgeois and enemy. It was easy to distinguish. But today, in the world of the new left-wing parties, how can you distinguish good socialism from bad communism when we have some aesthetic borrowings by intellectual activists? How can you distinguish? Is it at all possible?
Oui, donc je suis content de vous poser la question sur les social-démocrates d'une façon générale.
Well, when we
D'abord, il faut savoir que ce sont, ils ont été les premiers à être liquidés par les premiers. I need to say
they were the first to abandon communism. In all countries where communism existed, where there were socialists or social democrats,
et il n'était pas question que les cousins germains
you can say they were sort of close cousins.
C'est celle du parti.
But what mattered, there was only one voice, the party's voice. So they were eliminated. What I regret about social democratic parties, even if I don't feel related to them, when communists collapsed, they weren't as good as they should have been. So,
ils auraient pu profiter de ce passé de martyr, et je pense qu'il y a eu chez les socialistes
benefited the image of martyrs. They had this complex of the left-wing party. The communists managed to
dans le problème de la gauche, d'une façon générale, surtout de la gauche extrême, une espèce de course à l'échalote.
Persuade socialists and social democrats into something. So when you have an extreme left-wing party, it will impose the tone that was in the 1920s. Because of that, socialists, because of those bourgeois complexes, after what happened in global history, this left-wing party complex that accompanied the Democrats, which perhaps is not that strong any longer, especially in France. I'm back to France. Sorry for that.
Donc on voit que ça existe encore, parce que les socialistes sont alliés
au
communisme, parce que Mélenchon n'est pas membre de la partie communiste.
Front, Mr. Mélenchon, they are pretty popular. They are extreme left-wing.
Ce que je regrette,
but in a nutshell, what I regret about socialists is this left-wing complex. I pity that because communism collapsed in Central and Eastern Europe. At that time, a lot of communist parties, because in some countries like Romania, they got back to power,
à la deuxième internationale. Je rappelle pour ceux qui ne le savent pas que la deuxième internationale,
joined the second international. Let me remind you, that was the one socialist international that it was turned into third one, and that all was headed for communism.
D'opportunités politiques,
then the next one was dissolved.
Et donc les communistes ont adhéré, pour toujours rester à gauche bien sûr, à la seconde internationale.
The communists were always
ils ont été acceptés. Ils ont été acceptés sans problème. On leur a pas demandé de faire l'autocritique, on leur a pas demandé éventuellement de battre leur coulpe pour ce qui a été fait dans les pays où ils ont été. Non, pas du tout. Donc ça, je pense que c'est un grand péché.
Not to fight for everything, but I believe that's a major sin of social democrats.
Les partis communistes anciens,
communist parties, the old communist parties, the ones that converted into social democratic parties, they've become social democrats, perhaps.
Il n'y a plus vraiment de partis communistes, de faux-nés communistes.
There are no more communist parties.
Donc, d'ailleurs, c'est intéressant parce que c'est en vérité une revanche de l'histoire. Parce que ce qui était prévu par Lénine, c'était que
what Lenin could foresee was that communism would absorb socialists, which means it would terminate them because they would no longer exist. And what happened, and the story was pretty long, history means time that goes on for a long time, and the problem of history is that it's not the time of a single man. We speak of, when we speak of decades, when we speak about history, we speak of ages. And now we can see that the socialists took revenge, because as I told you, they managed to
très cher dans l'histoire. Je ne sais pas si je réponds à vos questions,
kick the communists.
Ja wiem, to jest kwestia bardzo złożona i ona właściwie wymagałaby rozbicia teraz na czynniki pierwsze i dyskusji na temat tego, dlaczego na przykład te konwencjonalne, klasyczne partie socjaldemokratyczne z drugiej strony też przeżywają kryzys, co widać w wynikach wyborów prezydenckich czy parlamentarnych we Francji, a z drugiej strony właśnie nowa lewica we Francji i innych krajach zyskuje poparcie, ale właśnie
is gaining support, but it's mixing up different arguments using the war of class argument in a different way, or even abandoning it.
Je suis moins inquiet par ce côté, cette revivance, cette résurgence, lutte des classes, etc., par cette extrême gauche, même
I
française,
wouldn't be too worried about this new emergence of the war of classes, whether in France or in different countries. There is a new aspect. We have a true front of radical right-wing parties, which we see, for example, in Germany.
Ne repasse pas les plats, comme on dit. L'histoire ne repasse pas les plats.
We know history never repeats itself.
Par les charmantes dames qui traduisent. Mais on est revenu dans une espèce de
I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, but we are going back to this polarization, radical left and radical right, and this worries me.
Dans cet arc de cercle, disons,
because I'm actually a centrist.
Les démocrates, voilà ce que j'appellerais les démocrates, sont pris en sandwich par ces deux extrêmes.
So
donc,
what I would call Democrats are like in a sandwich. They are surrounded from both sides.
C'est quand même le plus grand pays communiste du monde aujourd'hui et celui qui est le plus dangereux.
And let me refer to China. This is the largest communist country, the most dangerous one. They are the ones getting ready for war. Let's be clear about that. I do study China a lot, so I am really worried about the situation around Democrats. Even though they've been weakened, we see that, for example, in the US, in the electoral campaign, we can say that Trump represents the radical right, though that would be a bit of an exaggeration, and his rival, the radical left, although again, it's an exaggeration.
Avec la guerre qui est à nos portes, encore plus à vos portes qu'à la nôtre d'ailleurs, parce que vous êtes plus proche du front que nous le sommes.
And it's all happening in this country, which is very susceptible to even the smallest phenomena.
De l'époque 1917, même stalinien, même maoïste, c'est plus le même, c'est plus du tout le même.
So as for communism from 1917 or the Maoist version, of course today's communism is different than the old one, but communism is trying to gain control over our life space, over our whole reality.
Très préoccupante.
And it's resorting to different threats, and that's really worrying.
Très préoccupante, et je trouve qu'il y a du côté des opinions publiques, pas du côté
Maybe you had a question about China, but it's my favorite topic, so I'm talking about it right now.
Sur la Chine, à Washington et en Europe de façon générale, bien sûr au Japon.
From the viewpoint of regular people, not politicians, a lot has been said from the viewpoint of Japan and other Asian countries which are nearby. But there is a naive approach towards China. We look at Chinese products which seem to be good. We have cars, we have iPhones, and I mean all smartphones produced in China.
Des marchés, ça c'est typiquement capitalisme, mais aussi de conquête.
And then we do have this will to conquer the markets, which is a capitalist drive, but they also want to conquer the territories. And that is not normal, and it's a serious threat.
Qui, à mon avis, risque de nous amener à un troisième conflit mondial. J'en suis même intimement convaincu maintenant.
In my view, this can lead to the Third World War. And I'm quite convinced of that now.
Excusez-moi cet humour froid, mais
my wife tells me that you've been talking about it so long, you may actually cause it. But I think that's where we are heading.
O Chiny, ale w szerszym kontekście i częściowo już z tego zwolniony. Powiem tak, przez tomy pańskiej światowej historii komunizmu rzeczywiście przebija człowiek.
All the volumes of your world history of communism, we really see human beings, the executioners, the victims,
kartami tego dzieła są strony, które opisują
those who are to blame,
tortury, nieszczęścia,
what really stands out are all the tortures, the isolation, the exclusion. On many continents, just basically torturing the enemies of the people.
Myślałem sobie, że jednocześnie
when I was reading the most bleak passages in the book, I was thinking that how people act depends on the one hand on the culture, and then on the other hand where communism was operating. But there is also a universalism being shown here. For example, in the Soviet Union and China, if let's say China and Vietnam were having conflicts, the system was maintained due to their mutual ties. But in your opinion, what is the secret of this global universalism?
Takiej kategorycznej recepcji komunizmu
of this fact that communism was so
abstrahując oczywiście od tego, że pewne odpowiedzi nasuwają się same, tak jak wymordowanie elity, jak utrzymywanie terrorem spokoju. Dlaczego tak rzadko wybuchały rewolucje przeciwko
komunistom? But what do you think about that?
Je voudrais parler un peu de la grammaire, si je puis dire, de ces trois livres qui se complètent. D'abord, c'est un récit, c'est très important, c'est pas une histoire classique.
Let me tell you about the three volumes that complement each other. So it's not a classical history, it's more of a description.
Je voulais montrer l'universalité.
So I wanted to have them exactly in this order, the executioners, the victims, and the accomplices. And due to the geographical location, these people are important. So we have a history viewed from three perspectives. From the viewpoint of the authorities, this can be described chronologically. And here I pay a lot of attention to 1917, and I end with Afghanistan. That is transformed into a communist country.
Qui n'est pas encore traduite en polonais, dans le troisième livre qui est sur les complices.
And the collapse of communism is described in the third volume, which has not been translated into Polish yet.
Et le deuxième tome, c'est vue d'en bas, vue de la société, vue de...
So the first volume provides the view of the authorities, and the second one is the viewpoint, the perspective of victims. I cried when I was writing this book, and I am still very moved by various aspects that I described.
Par le martyr des peuples qui ont vécu. Alors, la Pologne a été sans doute un des moins martyrisés. M'en voyez pas.
Some of the actions of the communists were absolutely despicable, and even today it's hard to talk about them. In Central Europe, there were many victims, also in Poland.
Grâce en grande partie à l'Église, évidemment.
But the proportion of the power was a bit different, also thanks to the Catholic Church. It played a significant role, and that protected Poland in a way, unlike Romania, where that factor was not present. I know Romania very well.
Les victimes. Et le troisième tome, c'est les complices qui, encore une fois, je raconte la même histoire, mais du côté
So that's the second volume, the victims, and then the third volume, the accomplices. So this is the same story described from the viewpoint of Western countries. We mentioned Aragorn, but we could also mention dozens of other writers who do appear in the book, and some of them do not appear. Please remind me, what was your question about universalism? Okay. So let me go back to what I said before. I already partly answered that question. So you always have a commander. Let's say a Marxist one. Let me repeat, everything was invented by Lenin. He is the main perpetrator. He is the one to blame. He hated the bourgeoisie. He did not like humankind, generally speaking. And everyone else drew on that. That's where the Gulag comes from, starvation, that actually was not predicted by Lenin, even though the first starvation took place when he was still in power. So it's all related to what I said before. That's why we can talk about universal communism. So as we said, that theory is great, but it did not work in practice because of people. But it's also the people who come up with theory, so we cannot separate one from the other. And this is absolutely false, regardless on the history, the past, the culture, the geography. And geography is so important for people as it determines the history. So regardless of all these factors which enrich human lives, everywhere we came to the same moment. And then we got basically the same results, although there were some differences in different countries. So there is no human error here. We can say the theory is inherently
taka przyjmowalność
erroneous.
systemu mogła wynikać z głębokiego przeświadczenia, czy wręcz wierzenia ludzi
So can this stem from this deep belief of people involved in the system?
Komunizm.
Doesn't this distinguish communism? I doubt whether some socialists or liberals have ever moved so deep to such a deep belief.
Oui. Alors,
Without any doubt.
Vous avez raison. Un des grands succès du communisme, si je puis dire, et d'avoir mis ses pas dans une forte croyance humaine.
One big success of communism, if I may say so, is that it really went deep into human beliefs.
Et je pourrais dire que
so that's our human nature. We want to believe in something. And I believe that's the success of communism, that in a way they were able to replace what Christianity offers.
Les communistes disent, le paradis, on va le construire ici. Et vous allez
So,
voir,
for
ça va être
example,
formidable.
that we
Et cette
will
espérance,
all
évidemment,
live in
est
paradise.
de succès, d'espoir du côté,
But
pas du côté des
they
intellectuels.
promise
pour les
something
raisons
like
expliquées
that
tout à l'heure,
here
mais
on
du côté
earth.
des peuples,
That's what
du côté
communism promises.
oui, du côté des populations. Et c'est vrai que le communisme a représenté beaucoup
So it's
d'espoir,
also
de fait.
on the side of people themselves
avant
who do
que le
believe in
stalinisme
that.
commence
And communism
à
represents
dégénérer,
this
dégénérer,
belief.
excusez-moi, mauvais mot, commence à appliquer vraiment la théorie, disons, dans les années, si vous
So
regardez les
even
écrits dans les
before
années 17
Stalin started to implement that
à
theory,
27 dirons-nous,
let's
là, il y a
say
quand même
between
beaucoup. Après, ça devient plus
1917
difficile parce que Trotsky
27,
disparaît, il représentait un autre
this
espoir.
was one
Petite parenthèse.
period. Then
Heureusement,
Trotsky
n'a pas pris le pouvoir, parce que ça
disappeared.
aurait sans doute été encore pire que Staline.
Unfortunately,
Parenthèse,
Trotsky
il était le
did not
théoricien par
take
excellence.
over.
Donc, il
I
aura appliqué
think
le
that would be even
léninisme
worse
100%,
than
donc
what happened under
je n'ai pas
Stalin.
d'innocence en ce qui concerne Trotsky, mais à partir du moment où
Also
Staline prend
a
le
matter
pouvoir,
of
à partir du moment où le premier
whether
procès
you're
arrive, à partir
just
du moment
focused
où
on
la
theory
famine en
and to what
Ukraine
extent you want to
commence, nous sommes en
implement it.
1932
Then
quand même,
Stalin took over.
et
Then
ça
when
se
you had
sait,
the
même
Great
si c'est caché.
Hunger in Ukraine,
Donc,
so
tout
in
ça devient impossible
1932,
d'être innocent. L'innocence n'est plus possible.
that's when it started.
L'innocence n'est plus possible. Donc, ce qui permet de masquer
Innocence is no
les
longer
faits
an option. You
c'est la
cannot
croyance. Et vous
conceal
savez, il n'y a rien de
certain
pire que la croyance.
things.
Si vous
You
croyez,
cannot hide away the
aucun fait ne
facts.
peut
They are
si vous croyez
there.
vraiment,
So
aucun
all
fait
that
ne peut vous détourner
remains
votre
is
croyance.
faith, is belief, and there is
Donc
nothing
voilà,
worse than
et c'est la force du
blind
communisme
faith.
d'avoir réussi à donner cette espérance.
That's the strength of communism, that it gave hope.
Pas aussi,
Just like
pas aussi
with the radical
clairement
left.
qu'à l'époque léniniste, mais aussi des espérances d'un monde meilleur qui nous attend, pour lequel nous allons œuvrer. Alors je dis pas qu'il faut pas œuvrer à un monde meilleur, bien sûr qu'il faut œuvrer à un monde meilleur, et chacun espère que notre monde de demain sera meilleur que celui d'aujourd'hui, évidemment, sauf que ça dépend de la méthode. Or, les communistes avaient la prétention d'avoir non seulement la méthode, mais la seule méthode, et ceux qui n'étaient pas d'accord avec leur méthode devaient être éliminés.
That their method is the only proper one and it should be implemented everywhere.
Jest na pewno dużo mniej w skali świata. Nawet podejrzewam w Chinach czy w innych krajach, gdzie na zasadzie pewnej skamieliny retoryka komunistyczna się
when you
utrzymała
have this fossilized communist rhetoric,
nie doszło do zmiany reżimu państwowego,
so there was no change in the regime, such as in Laos, Vietnam, Cuba, or in the Transnistria Republic, which that state is not recognized by the international community. But if you look at their emblem, it's a typical emblem of a Soviet republic. But communism has not completely fallen, as you already said.
Będzie złożone z dwóch.
And this is my final question. So from the viewpoint of the author and in the hindsight of almost 10 years, how were the 3 volumes received in France? And don't apologize for focusing on France.
Tej książki i czy myśli pan choć to oczywiście piękna, wielka, zamknięta całość, czy myśli pan o ewentualnym tomie czwartym
a certain whole, but are you thinking about a fourth volume?
Dzisiejszych kontynuacjach,
about today's continuation of communism. In other books you mentioned other events that followed communism.
Pas de suite. Pour moi, c'est pas une histoire close. Encore une fois, c'est pas parce que l'histoire est close, mais c'est parce
there won't be a continuation. For me, this is
je pense plus à travailler sur le monde d'aujourd'hui et pas sur même, vous me direz évidemment. Mais en même temps, nous ne sommes pas vraiment dans un monde post-communiste. Nous sommes à la fois dans un monde post-communiste et dans un monde
something I could continue working on, but we do not live in post-communist times. Well, it's complicated when it comes to human faith and beliefs. Let's go back to the Chinese. Do they believe in communism? Of course they don't.
Plus vous montez dans la hiérarchie, c'est autre chose.
And the members of the party, it's something else. If we see that there are many more in the hierarchy, that is something else.
Raisonne en communiste marxiste-léniniste et
do the Chinese authorities believe in communism?
Du bureau politique,
yes, of course, that is their guiding motto. So those in power, yes, that's how they want to move forward.
la paix intérieure.
Regular
Ils ont énormément souffert. La révolution
Chinese
culturelle
people,
a été un drame
no,
absolu.
they
dont
do
on n'a
not.
aucune idée.
And there is the matter of
Au monde
internal
occidental, je veux dire,
peace.
de ce que
That's
ça
a
été.
country that
Donc, ils veulent
suffered
une
a
paix
lot.
sociale. C'est bien la chance du pouvoir d'ailleurs.
So
C'est la
they
chance
want
du pouvoir communiste
peace.
aujourd'hui.
They want
Parce qu'ils savent
social
très bien
peace.
qu'ils ne veulent pas recommencer, que le peuple chinois ne veut absolument pas recommencer l'immense bordel, excusez-moi du mot, qu'a été la révolution culturelle.
And I think they know that otherwise they can have a big mess,
C'est vrai que la réussite
just like
chinoise
the
est assez
Cultural
exceptionnelle de ce côté-là.
Revolution. And let's
Pas parce que
remember
c'est
about
communiste,
that
c'est
great
grâce à nous.
hunger.
Soyons clairs, c'est nous
That
qui avons
was
tout fourni.
also
Nous avons fourni
something
le
that
matériel,
affected them
les
deeply.
savoir-faire, l'argent.
We actually
Absolument
received
tout. Je dis
everything.
bien
We were providing money, know-how,
l'intelligence
everything.
du régime chinois et d'avoir su profiter de cette manne, si je puis dire, hein, pour justement faire de ce pays le deuxième
So
pays
the
du monde,
Chinese
aujourd'hui en pleine puissance, et pour faire
authorities
de
were
son peuple,
smart because they knew
sous
how
un régime
to
communiste
use that.
assez
They were
strict,
actually the
parce
second
qu'ils sont
global
surveillés,
superpower
énormément,
in
hein,
certain terms.
considérablement. Le peuple chinois n'est pas libre de faire ce qu'il veut. Hein. Je parle à l'intérieur.
But they were able to keep that under control.
À l'époque du rideau de fer.
So
c'est très compliqué de sortir.
they do not
Alors que là, les
live
Chinois
in a free
peuvent aller
state
au Galeries
like we do.
Lafayette ou
It's all very
n'importe où en
complicated.
France, ailleurs, s'ils sont riches, bien sûr, s'ils ont de l'argent. Bon, bref. Donc l'intelligence du Parti communiste chinois,
Of
c'est
course,
d'avoir
those
donné
Chinese who are
le
rich,
beurre,
who have a lot of money, they
au peuple
can
chinois,
travel
mais pas
abroad.
la manière de faire le beurre. Hein.
For example, to France.
Vous avez une question, non?
So they gave them food, but not the
Obawiam
means
się, że
to...
okej, pół minuty.
For production
Jaka
of
była
food.
recepcja książki?
Ah oui. Bon. Écoutez, j'ai travaillé 10 ans là-dessus. Quand je dis j'ai travaillé 10 ans, j'ai travaillé 10 ans.
So I spent 10 years working on
pendant 10 années.
this book, and it was really
ça a marché.
365 days a year for
C'est pas
all
une question de
these
succès,
years.
c'est pas une question de vente. On s'en fout de ça. D'abord, c'est énorme.
And it's not a matter of
Lire,
success or
c'est plus rapide à
the
lire qu'à écrire, croyez-moi.
volume of sales,
Non, c'est-à-dire que je pense que ce
but
pays,
it's
cette
well
France,
easier to read it
a
than to
tellement
write
été,
it, and it takes less
elle a joué un rôle
time.
très important dans cette histoire, très important. La Révolution française dans l'esprit de Lénine et dans
But I
l'esprit de
think
Staline.
France plays
c'est quelque
a
chose de
significant
considérable.
role here. The French Revolution.
C'est un héros. Oui,
Lenin
je veux
and
dire,
Stalin did
pour
have
le
that
monde
in
communiste.
mind. Robespierre was a
Il y a
hero
tellement-
of
il y a
theirs.
tellement une
for the communist
abrégation
world.
entre cette histoire et l'histoire de la Révolution française que
So
c'est pas qu'on est génies
there were
en
many
tournure, mais que
interconnections between the French
on veut pas
Revolution
faire un cas
and
de
the
conscience, si je
communists.
puis dire. Donc on passe. Alors ça passe comme bon. Ceci dit, ça reste parce que
You have to take that into
c'est pas pour me
account.
vanter, mais il n'y a aucun livre au monde de cette ampleur, je veux dire, sur le sujet. Par un seul
I
auteur.
don't want
Il y
to
a des
brag,
universitaires
but I
qui ont
believe
travaillé
that no
indépendamment, les spécialistes de
other
la Chine,
book
Cuba,
of
etc.
such scale
Mais
has
une
ever
vision
been written
d'une
on
seule
this
personne,
topic.
la mienne, encore une fois,
Various
subjective,
researchers, of
comme je
course,
l'ai dit tout à
dealt
l'heure,
with various
ça
aspects of
n'existe pas. Donc, de toute
communism.
façon, dans 50 ans, ça
But
n'existera
my
pas.
vision, which is of course subjective, is written on a
Jeżeli
large
Państwo
scale,
popatrzą w
and that's the
bibliografię
only
tych
one
tomów, a
that
zakładam, że
covers
to jest
such
bibliografia
topics.
wybrana, to zobaczą Państwo na jak olbrzymiej bazie i nie tylko samych książkach, opracowaniach, źródłach, ale też, jak już słyszeliśmy dzisiaj, kontaktach z ludźmi,
So
którzy stali po
you
obu stronach
said
systemu, ale też
that you
z
had
tym
contacts with
wyjątkowym
people from
doświadczeniem
both
dysydentów.
sides
Te
of
książki
the
były
system,
pisane. Niech
but
Państwa nie
you
zniechęci
also had some
rozmiar,
experiences
ponieważ te
with the
książki są napisane
dissidents.
po pierwsze
So
rzeczywiście
don't
w
be
wymiarze
disencouraged
człowieka.
by
Przeczytałem,
the sheer size
gorąco
of the
Państwu
books.
polecam,
I read them
ale też
and
te
I
książki
truly encourage
właśnie,
you to read them.
choć autor jest łącznikiem, ponieważ znał tych
And
ludzi,
the
którzy
author is an
doświadczali
intermediary
systemu, te
because
książki
he
są
knew the
napisane
people who
zdecydowanie, mogę
were
to powiedzieć,
impacted by the
dla
system.
czytelnika
But
XXI-wiecznego.
I will say that these are books for readers from the 21st century.
Nasz autor będzie teraz podpisywał na
So
dole
now
tam
the
przy
author will be
stoisku
signing his
księgarskim
books
egzemplarze dla Państwa.
on the ground floor.
Będzie można też porozmawiać kuluarowo
And then
po
you
francusku
can
czy po angielsku.
talk to
A ja
him
chciałbym,
in French or in
żebyśmy nagrodzili
English,
wielkimi
and
brawami
let's give him a big
naszego
round of
autora,
applause.
Thierry Wolton. A osobnymi brawami chciałbym, żeby Państwo jeszcze nagrodzili nasze
And
tłumaczki.
also let's thank
Dwie
our
panie, które tam nam
interpreters, the
bardzo
two
pomagały.
ladies who did a great job.
Jedzą kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Żadnej dziennikarz telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Przygotowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.
Für Deutschland.
TVP Info. Włącz się na nowo.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
Plany biznesowe powstają z marzeń. Dlatego nie ma dwóch takich samych firm. Jedni chcą działać na całym świecie. Innym cały świat mieści się w dłoni. Sukces biznesu to nie tylko jego wielkość, ale też szczęście, jakie przynosi ludziom. PKO Bank Polski.
Uwielbiam szycie w sieci. Wczoraj podszyłem się pod wnuczka, wieczorem uszyłem intrygę na apce randkowej, a dziś planuję grubymi nićmi szyte oszustwo z promocją. Tak się szyje.
Na oszustów są sposoby. Zapoznaj się z poradami ekspertów na niedajsiepodszyć.pl.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihrer Ausreise.
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 000 osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.
Dziś Nowy Jork, jutro Londyn. Za chwilę Paryż, Warszawa, Berlin. Na całym świecie kultura pulsuje rytmem. Wystarczy tylko włączyć dwójkę. Dwójka, Polskie Radio. Jesteś na miejscu.